Well, thanks for coming out tonight to our Smyser Community Lecture, which the Friends of ORNL sponsors. Just a little advertisement for the Friends of ORNL. This is a group of people in the community who are interested in what's going on at ORNL and other scientific and technical activities. And we get together once a month on Tuesdays, the second Tuesday of every month. And we'd love to have you come, and you might even decide to join. It's very expensive. It's $20 a year. Or if you think you have many years left, be a lifetime member for $200. So you do the math and decide what's the best deal. But anyway, be happy, member or not, we'd be happy to have you come on the second Tuesday. We meet at the UT Center. We gather about 11. The soup kitchen, who sampled their fare tonight, comes and brings sampling of soups and chili. And we have some time to chat with each other, and then we have a speaker each month. And so if you have Tuesday around 11 to 1 open, come join us. So we're so pleased you could come tonight. You know, this lecture series is in honor of Dick Smyser, who's the publisher of the Oak Ridger for many years and had sort of national roles in the Associated Press. This got started, I think, 19 years ago. Sorry, I'm the newbie. 19 years ago, and we do this several times a year, and it's a good opportunity for people to hear something interesting. And I think tonight we have a very interesting speaker, and Bob is going to introduce him.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Tonight's program is about atomic accidents, a history of nuclear meltdowns and disasters from the Ozark Mountains to Fukushima. It will be presented by Dr. James Mahaffey. Jim Mahaffey holds a Bachelor of Science degree in physics and master's and doctoral degrees in nuclear engineering from Georgia Tech. During a 25-year career at the Georgia Tech Research Institute, he directed or worked on projects for the U.S. Defense Nuclear Agency, U.S. National Ground Intelligence Center, U.S. Air Force Air Logistics Center, Georgia Power Company, and other government and industrial organizations. And his work is in such areas as nuclear power, nonlinear analysis, digital systems design, and cold fusion. That would be interesting. He is now a full-time writer and consultant. He appears on PBS NewsHour, on Georgia Public Broadcasting's Georgia Weekly, and on numerous radio talk shows. Jim's first book, Atomic Awakening, A New Look at History and Future of Nuclear Power, in 2009, received wide critical acclaim. His latest book, Atomic Accidents, was released in February of 2014, is the basis for the presentation tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mahaffey.
Actually, I don't think anything has ever melted down in the Ozark Mountains. But I find that the author has very little control over the subtitle. I start out the book with an author's note, and I wanted to talk about hydroelectric dams. There was an urge to build things very large under Stalin. He wanted the biggest, most spectacular technology he could come up with. And they decided to build a very large hydro dam in Siberia. It actually makes billions of watts of electricity. And I think it's 70% of the electricity used in Siberia, which is a big place. It's quite a showcase of a piece of technology. But then just a few years ago, a log was floating down the river. Somehow it made it through the trash gate, fell 660 feet through the penstock, one of these generators, this one right here, and jammed it solid. Now, a generator works very sweetly without vibration in two situations. If it's running at full speed and if it's standing dead still. And any other configuration, it wants to hop up and down. This generator started hopping, and it went through that nice picture window in the front, and the generator house began to fill with the lake behind it. The transformers overheated, they exploded, and just about everything in there came tumbling down. The entire enormous plant became a field of debris in 30 seconds. 75 men lost their lives there. Now, I point that out just to show that there are other ways to make electricity that are just as dangerous as nuclear power. Note that Chernobyl killed 54 men and it took several weeks to do so. This thing killed 75 men in 30 seconds. It also spread carcinogen. It was used as a fire retardant in the generators down the river, and it polluted hundreds of square miles of populated area. So that's a carcinogen that spilled, killed people, destroyed a very expensive plant, and that's just because it uses water. Water is a very dangerous thing, as we found out at Fukushima. So that was my author's note. Just to get the reader in the mood. Oops, wrong. Then I have an introduction. Now, I start off very slow with this thing. So I start off by talking about my earliest datable memory. It's the earliest thing I can remember that I can actually put a date on. And that was the wreck of the Gainesville Midland GM208 engine right south of Gainesville. For some reason, we were in the area, and my father cranked up the Studebaker and drove us out there to see it. I think it was 1954. I was about 3 years old. And I was very impressed with the size and the mass of the locomotive. It was over on its side. I wondered how on earth they were going to pick that thing up and put it back on the rails. I figured they'd just cover it up with dirt. As it turns out, that particular engine, as shown in the picture on the left, was actually built for the Tsar of Russia, the last Tsar, Tsar Nicholas, in 1918, but for some reason he was unable to pay for it. The manufacturer then adjusted the gauge to make it run on American rails and put it up for auction. It's a 10-driver freight engine. It's called the Russian. And Gainesville Midland was a very small railroad. They ran between Gainesville and Winder. But I learned something from that experience. I learned that there's a great deal of show in a train wreck. Now, in the 19th century, steam locomotives were actually used a great deal. By 1954, Georgia had just about eliminated every steam train in the state. By 1950, they decided we got to get rid of these things and go diesel. But in the 19th century, everything in the United States ran on steam. They didn't have nuclear power to be afraid of back then, but they had steam to be afraid of. And you see people now are irrationally sometimes afraid of nuclear power. That's one reason we're not using it as much as we could. It was the same thing with steam power back in the 19th century. People were afraid of steam explosions. You know, everybody had heard of a steam explosion. Few people had actually seen one. But when one occurred, it was so unexpected, just out of nowhere. You'd be standing by a train station, all of a sudden an engine blows up. Or one would run off a trestle into the ravine and explode. This was a huge problem in the 19th century. There was a small railroad called the Katy. It was out of Texas, Waco, Texas. And they had an employee named Bill Crush, and he had a brilliant idea. He said the reason people are afraid of steam explosions is they've never really seen one. If they could be close to one, if they could feel the shock wave and feel the heat against their face and all that, it would take away a lot of the unknown. And they'd be more likely to be unafraid of trains, and we'd get more ridership. So he suggested that they stage out in the field in Waco a crash. So they bought two old Civil War type locomotives, still worked, but they're quite obsolete, and painted them up. They put some cars behind them, hired some engineers who would do this. Engineers would crash them together. You know, they'd open the throttles and jump off. Things would build up enough speed over enough track length, hit and explode. And that's a picture of the Katy steam explosion just before they hit. It was an incredibly successful event. 50,000 people showed up. And I think only about 3 or 4 people were actually killed. Although there were hundreds of injured. That actually built a wooden platform for people to stand on so they could get close to it. And when the things hit, of course, they exploded with a lot of force, sent shrapnel going half a mile. And immediately people were scrambling over bodies to pick up pieces of the train. And there were a lot of fingers burnt, picking up bolts and things that were still red hot. But it showed that this was an unplumbed need in the human psyche to see a train wreck, you know, and experience it. Well, it became an industry. Train wrecks. They're used at fairs and racetracks and all kinds of things. You'd have a train wreck. And it became an industry. It didn't really end until about 1930 when it kind of played out. There was a plan to make a new type of wreck where they crash airplanes into each other. That didn't come about. And we've forgotten that this ever happened. But I use this, like I say, to get the audience up to speed about what we're talking about. What we're talking about is an industry that none of the ordinary people understand. They don't know what to be afraid of, why to be afraid of it, what not to be afraid of, why they shouldn't be afraid of it. It's just radiation. Everybody's afraid of radiation. Well, you should be afraid of radiation, but maybe not for the reasons you might think, and not under the conditions you might think. Radiation is dangerous under many conditions, and most of those do not exist around a nuclear power plant. But, for example, at TMI, you know, 3 Mile Island did have a meltdown, and people were immediately complaining about radiation sickness when there was no radiation sickness. It was all psychological radiation sickness. People got cancer and had stillbirths and everything because this nuclear plant had gone up. Well, actually you couldn't tell it had gone up with a Geiger counter right in front of you, but it didn't make any difference. It was radiation. So to get to people with what really goes on in a nuclear accident, I wrote this book. Before I wrote this thing, I'd written like 6 textbooks, very dry, very technical. One thing first thing my editor told me after I turned in a few chapters was, don't be cute. I didn't consciously be cute, but that's the way I write, I think. And I wrote this book so that ordinary people, not nuclear scientists necessarily, not nuclear engineers, could read it and get a good interpretation of what really happens in a nuclear accident. Of course, I started out wanting to write about every nuclear accident that ever happened. I quite soon realized that would be 9 volumes. And there'd be a lot of repetition. Believe it or not, we did the same accident over and over and over. And it gets kind of boring. Also wanted to dig up new stuff. I didn't want to just say the same thing over and over that other people had written about. And I found that in this environment that has existed for the past few years, you can find anything. I needed an original report from the NRX accident in Canada in 1950. I looked all over the place, every repository in Canada and the United States. I could always find the abstract of that paper. I could never find that paper, but I finally found it, a perfect facsimile with notes written in the margins and everything. It was from the author himself. I found it in the KGB archive, which is now online. Chapter 1, we discover fire. In other words, where did this fear of radiation come from? Well, we weren't afraid of radiation at first. But I asked myself, when was the first human being injured by radiation? Of course, that was the first guy who came out of his cave and got a sunburn. But that is lost to history. The first radiation accidents were probably in a silver mine in a mountain in what was Czechoslovakia. Miners in this mountain, which of course is full of radioactive byproducts like radon gas, they were getting sickness of the lungs. This was easily explained. They were upsetting the mountain dwarves' environment, and they were having revenge on them. And that explanation stood for a long time. And I think that's the first that I found indication of radiation sickness, was inhaling radon day after day after day in a dug cave. Aside from that, one of the most bizarre cases of radiation poisoning was in a cave in Arkansas, Ozark Mountains. And that's where the Ozark Mountains comes from in the subtitle. But I did a lot of research, and I think I found the actual cave where that happened. I can't go into that a lot because I've already used up 20 minutes. Got a lot more book to go on. But read the book, and you'll find out what I think was beta burn in a undisturbed radon cave in 1876. Discoveries of the century, of course, were radium and X-rays. Marie and Pierre Curie, of course, discovered polonium and radium. They both they didn't have the correct hygiene for working with radioactive materials. That was understandable because radioactivity had been discovered about a year before they started. but they both suffered from radiation diseases of various types. Nikola Tesla in the United States actually discovered the X-ray before Röntgen did. He took this picture of his foot. You can see the nails in his shoe. For some reason, he didn't see any medical need for that. When Röntgen discovered it, they were building medical X-ray machines within weeks. But what he wanted was something to take the place of narcotics. So, of course, first thing Tesla did was he stuck his head in the X-ray machine. And he describes this in an article he wrote in 1904, I think, for Electrical Technicians magazine. And this was the first indication that something bad could happen with radiation. He wasn't quite the same after his experiments. Radium, of course, became an industry. It was seen as a way to cure cancer. The alpha particle from radium has a very short range, of course, in tissue. So if you implant it in a tumor, it can kill the tumor without killing anything else. This was seen as something that nothing else could do. And cancer was as bad a scourge as it is today. So radium became quite popular. The problem with the radium was when they used it to make glowing paint. And this became a large industry, particularly for clock faces and watch faces. And out of that came the Radium Girls disaster. They found that women who were using little paintbrushes to paint the numbers would put a point on the paintbrush by twirling it on their tongue. And they started getting radium jaw. You don't realize it, but your jawbone is constantly being rebuilt, has huge stress on it. So your body has to constantly, daily, put new calcium in. Well, if you ingest radium, your body can't do a mass spectrometer, but it can do a chemical analysis. And it says, well, this is probably sodium, so it puts it in your jaw, and the alpha particles destroy the bones. And eventually there was a lawsuit, a class action suit, and it became clear that radium was extremely dangerous. This was in the 1920s. Now on the side, there was also a radiation cosmetic line. They're putting thorium and radium in cosmetics so it would clear up your face. Believe it or not, these cosmetics stopped being sold by 1960. Beginning of the end of radium. This is a bottle of Radiothor, and if I'm not mistaken, this is the only bottle that's known to exist, and I believe it's in this museum. In fact, I bought this picture from this museum to go in the book. Radiothor was an elixir, and a man named Eben Byers, who was wealthy, he hurt his arm. It was obviously a hairline fracture, but it wasn't ever diagnosed and treated as such. His doctors gave up, and he said, I'm going to try this new stuff, Radiothor. Took one bottle of it, made him feel good, so he decided to buy it by the case. And he drank it every day, all day. Eventually, of course, he died of radium poisoning, radiation poisoning caused by radium. And he was rich, so that got a lot of publicity. And from that instance, the Food and Drug Administration was born. And radium became a bad thing. And radium was thereafter linked to radiation. In fact, we went into World War II, and the only estimates we had about radiation damage to human beings that were used in predictions of damage from the atomic bombs was from radium. Wasn't particularly accurate. Chapter 2 is about World War II. That was, of course, the inflection point for nuclear science, nuclear engineering, nuclear everything. That's when nuclear became secret. We, of course, developed the atomic bomb. This is a new way to look at little boy. We've always thought of little boy as having a stationary annulus of rings of uranium, and they shot into the center of it a long thing made of uranium, a cylinder. That's not the way it was built at all. This was figured out by a man named John Coster Mullen, who's a truck driver in Wisconsin, who went around and examined all the museum copies of Little Boy, one of which is right here, found that they're all wrong, purposefully, because the AEC was afraid that somebody would see how it was made and build one. Of course, Little Boy is so simple, you don't have to have a copy of the original one to make one. But he figured it out, and he was quite correct, that they shot the annulus onto the solid core instead of the other way around. This is the most accurate depiction of the insides of the Little Boy so far. We got into this atomic bomb because we knew that Germany was obviously building their own. Germany, of course, discovered fission in 1938. They had a competent staff of nuclear physicists who could obviously build a bomb quicker than anybody in the world, and we were very much afraid that they were going to do this. So it turns out what they had, what they accomplished was the first reactor accident. It was subcritical. It exploded because of water getting into metallic uranium. And it was a chemical reaction. It exploded. Aside from that, they didn't do a damn thing. This is not the reactor that exploded. This is the Hydroelectric reactor. This is a reproduction of it. We found at the end of the war in a cave under the cathedral at Hydroelectric. That's where the Germans had been forced to move their work. One reason they failed is because they had to keep moving because of Allied bombing raids, which was a good thing. They didn't approach criticality by any stretch. Thing would have to be 3 times that big to be critical. Tickling the Dragon at Los Alamos. Amazingly, nobody died in the furious development of 2 types of atomic bomb. That was amazing. But right after the war, within weeks or days after the war was officially over, we lost 2 scientists in criticality accidents with the same ball of plutonium. It was then called the Demon Core. First one was Harry Daghlian. He was using this thing on the left. They were always, of course, trying to find the critical size of this ball in its static configuration. He was stacking blocks of tungsten carbide around it. He dropped one of them and fell on top. The thing went supercritical. Not only that, it went prompt supercritical. He died days later. It took 1,000 rims in the chest. His supervisor, Louis Slotin, was doing almost the same thing with the same ball. This time he was lowering a hemisphere onto it and levering it off with a screwdriver. Screwdriver slipped, the thing went down on it. And you got to realize these plutonium spheres it's not like a thermal reactor. It's very, very close to criticality, and the difference between prompt critical and subcritical is very small. And fell on it, he died. A few days later, got 1,000 rims. After that, I don't think they used that particular sphere anymore. In fact, they used it on a certain test in the Pacific Ocean. From that was born the Godiva assembly. Of course, a lot of work was done at Oak Ridge. These are two famous photographs. One on the left is X10, the face of X10, and one on the right is the voltage regulator at Y12. I don't have to tell you anything about these today. It is in the book, Howard. Chapter 3, bit of trouble in the Great White North. Canada had its own atomic bomb program. They were trying to build a reactor first, as most efforts do. They started by piling sacks full of coal dust in a corner of a room with some uranium. And they found that that wasn't going critical the way they thought it was, fortunately. And they had to move on to a bigger program. The Brits took over, sent some people over. They started a lab in Chalk River, Ontario. And the rest is history. In Canada, the first working nuclear reactor outside the United States was built. It's called ZEEP. It's a small building on the left. It's like a barn. And ZEEP had the first criticality accident in a research reactor. Not the first criticality accident ever. But that incident was unknown until 1993, when they were doing a history of nuclear power, and they were interviewing all these ancient scientists, and 3 of them admitted that it had a criticality accident in ZEEP and had not reported it. So that goes down as the first unreported criticality accident. That thing on the right is a rebuild of NRX. NRX is in the huge brick building on the right. NRX is quite famous for having the first nuclear core meltdown in the world. A few minutes later, they had the first hydrogen explosion in a nuclear reactor. This is a very interesting accident, and I cover it in some detail in the book. But Jimmy Carter was assigned by Rickover, he was in the nuclear navy at that time, to go to Chalk River and help with the cleanup. That way he would have officers who had experience in cleaning up a nuclear accident. We didn't have nuclear accidents in the United States, so we had to go to Canada to get them. Canadians were glad to get